Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen and let's write ourselves a spec and some pseudocode. And what I'm also going to do today is I've taken the list of everyone in the class. I've randomized the order through the power of Google Sheets, and I have a randomized list of everyone's names. And we'll see at appropriate times, maybe just start calling on people to ask questions as we build some of this, especially as some pieces of this are really about kind of review and reinforcing knowledge. So hopefully this will be like kind of a good interactive lesson. And in that vein, definitely if you have something you want to see again or a question, just speak up. That's really what today is for. And just to make sure, can everyone see my screen with VS Code right now?
Yep.
Awesome. So we're going to build a polls app. I have a rough description of the application here. I have a little blurb on how to write a spec, and then we're going to spec it out. And just to introduce a little bit of introductory terminology, spec is short for specification. It is also sometimes, well, a requirement is not the same thing. A requirement is some sort of aspect of your program that's required and is part of a spec. And especially when we get into sort of like the workshops around product design and development, and for group projects, we'll learn more about this, but specs are usually broken into tickets or cards, aka tasks. And we're really going to write a spec. We're going to write out some pseudocode or implementation steps. And there's a couple reasons why this is valuable. Really pseudocode. So here's why it's good, even if you don't do this all the time, because everyone does sort of have their own workflow, to be able to write out the steps of the work you're about to do. It impresses interviewers in technical interviews. And if you get lost in the interview, it gives you a map to refer back to. And actually, kind of related to pair programming, how do people find pair programming versus programming solo? I know it can be tricky because you're meeting a new person often, but do you find a difference in your productivity or focus when you're pairing versus working by yourself? Not everyone likes pair programming, so it's okay, more than okay to say that you prefer programming by yourself. It's an honest question.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing that Johnny's saying. Like when it's new material, I don't really enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that's not uncommon. I think that's an uncomfortable place to be. At the same time, I will say I think the value of the pairing is worth it for us. I do agree that with new material, there's a lot to be said to having some time for yourself. At the same time, I think one of the hardest things to learn about kind of stepping into the profession of software engineering is that like part of our job this is a little bluntly put, is just to be very open about our ignorance among the members of our team, because no one knows everything, especially when things get specialized. And really, like the whole point of how modern software development works is that the team is there to help us with that. So I think that is a skill worth learning. And I know that that's a bit of a journey. What about pairing on, well, we don't really have a ton of pairing, I guess, on days with content that you're familiar with. What I was wondering is if anyone found pairing easier because you don't have to think about what to do and how to do it at the same time. And that may not be the case. That especially when you're working on things where you're not learning something new, I would say this is often seen as one of the benefits of pairing. And really, it's where it helps to be working with the same person too. But separate thinking about what to do from how to do it. And this hasn't been so relevant, honestly, up until now. Now that our projects are getting bigger, tasks are getting more complex, this becomes more relevant. The other reason to care about writing pseudocode and having a sort of like planning step in your workflow is studies have shown it does increase programmer productivity. Some people do this on paper, some people do it here, some people might actually write code. I think it's a valuable tool to know. And I know I've said this before, but about half my computer science undergraduate degree was writing stuff out on paper. Including writing a program. Like when I want to design a data model, go get a piece of paper. So this is kind of why we're going to walk through this. And also because you will see more and more loosely defined tasks. And really a software engineer's job is to turn unknowns and complexity into knowns and specificity. Right? In terms of jobs and careers and career growth, you know, Chat GPT can get pretty smart, but the role of a software engineer is to be that interface between Chat GPT and the product manager, or the interface between Django and the product manager, right? Like really software engineering is 50% technical and roughly 50% not about the hard technical skills. Obviously different specializations, like there's some variation here, but that largely holds true. A lot of our job is being able to understand the business side and customer and user needs and translate those into something that we or someone else can then implement in software. So we're going to go ahead and for our polls app, we're going to implement this spec. And I'm going to go ahead and grab this. And here's my rough process for writing a spec. Come up with a little bit of fake data so we can talk about the problem. Look for edge cases. As things come up, decide what to ignore or what's out of scope of what we want to focus on right now, what we have time to focus on, what our priorities are. Identify features. And so this raises a good question. What is a feature? And does someone want to take a crack at it? It sounds obvious, but I'd love to hear someone's thoughts. Is a Django model a feature? Yes or no?
No.
No.
I would agree. It's not. A feature is something that describes our program behavior, usually relevant to the user. For some programs, the user might be another program, like if you're writing the Pokemon API. Features often will span across multiple parts of our application. I actually have this here as well. And I think I'll just kind of start putting this up here and we can kind of map it out. So an easy way to come up with features is the user should be able to ... And I've kind of gone down this road already. But with our questions app, I could use some help. Let's make a list of things that the user should be able to do.
Answer a
Yeah,
question.
please. Yeah. Answer a question. What question?
A question that they may also be able to create.
A question that they may also be able to create. Where does that
Maybe they
question
can add
live?
questions.
Yeah. Answer a question that was a little, that was maybe a little bit too much of a trick question. What I was thinking of, answer a question that is part of a poll. And part of the value of writing out features is we sort of build up our mental models of what's going on here. And you made an excellent point. The user should also be able to create a question. What else should the user be able to do with the question?
View the results or the other answers, maybe.
Is that about questions or,
Well, the poll
oh,
would
that
be.
is about questions. That's a good point. View the correct answer to a question. When I create a question as a user, where is that question living? Not in terms of the database and models and stuff, in terms of the program features. And actually, I should follow my own advice here and come up with some toy data to do this. So let's do an example poll. Is your favorite food? What are some other questions that we want here? Please throw them in the chat. And I'll put them on the page. Okay, perfect. Awesome. We've got 4. That's a good amount. Oh, and chocolate is an excellent choice. Thank you. And I think I am just gonna, I'll start populating these. Django, Express, Ruby on Rails, and we'll put Laravel in there. Do you put on your left sock or right sock first? Why do we drive on parkways and park on driveways? Does the person who asked this question want to throw some possible answers, or anyone throw some possible answers to this into the chat, and I'll flesh it out.
Because people are weird. And I think the original term parkway comes from being a road that goes next to a park. So I don't know, because of historical convention.
Okay, beautiful. We have some great answers. I'm going to split my screen so we can look at things at the same time, and we can build out our features. And I think I am going to roll down the list of questions here. Or the list of students. So Yen, if you're there, and let me actually explain how I like to do answering questions. So basically, the rule is if I ask one of you a question, feel free to answer it. You can also phone a friend and just pass it to another person in the Zoom, or you can pass it back to me and I'll do that. So Yen, if you're there, going back to our list of features, we're starting to build out features around the questions. So as a user, when I create a question, where does it go?
To the database.
Goes in the database. Eventually, that's sort of at a lower level. What I would really say is create a question and add a question to a poll. Right. And in fact, this is a good example of why making mock data is useful. We actually only have one poll here. Let's make this 2 polls. And now we have a much more accurate model of some fake data, right? When I'm a user, I create a question and it's got to belong to a poll. Yen, if you're there, what's another feature of our application? Something that a user should be able to do.
To submit their answer.
Yeah, totally. I think we have that one over here, and I will actually rephrase that because I think that's a very good way to describe it. Submit an answer to a question. Running and thank you. And I think that's like, this is where language becomes more and more valuable as software developers when we write specifications and figure out features and stuff. Mason, you are next on the list, sir. What's another feature that our program will need that we don't currently have listed?
I just added it in the chat too, right before you said that, but it is edit a question.
Edit a question. Totally. And in fact, what I will do right now, I don't know if this will be useful, but I will throw the list of the randomized list of people that I'm using as a guide in our Tango Slack. So if you want to, if you have the screens to refer to that, you can kind of keep an eye on where you are in the order. Yeah, edited question. That's a great one. I'm going to put that under stretch features. And we'll call these, there's a term, minimum viable prototype. And this is like the absolute minimum number of things I need to get this product out the door. And that goes back to, I kind of made a point, like part of the job of doing this is deciding what to ignore. And in some ways, that's the most important part. Like that's a really valuable feature to have, and we will come back to that one later. Mike Jenkins, sir, another feature, please. I will just keep rolling down this list. And actually what I'll do, I think in the interest of time, is let's just throw some features in the chat here. What are we missing? We've got submitting an answer to a question. We've got creating a question. Yep, creating a poll.
Yeah, you got to create the poll in the first place. Yeah.
Yep. And I'm going to sort of order these as we go. Create a poll. Share a poll, save a poll. Yep. So save, I will say that that's part of create, right? Creating it. That's a good thing to separate. Construct the poll. Save the poll. Sharing, we don't have a concept of users yet, so there's no one to share it with. However, that is something definitely in a version 2. Delete a poll, totally, that's a good one. I'm going to put that under stretch features. Link poll results to dating profile. Yes, I think someone has gotten there already. I see modify or rewrite a poll. So when we modify a poll, what are we doing to it? And stepping back, sort of conceptually, right? What do we have in our program? We have questions, answers, and polls. That's sort of our universe. So if I modify a poll, what are the ways that I can modify it?
Delete the old and create a new one.
I would say that that's more about deleting a poll and creating a new poll. What I would say is to modify a poll, we could remove a question from a poll, right? And in fact, that's probably its own feature. A poll probably needs a title. It's going to need some sort of name, though that in itself is a stretch. So we'll put that there as well. Danazar, good question about correct answer. That actually raises a good point. I had been kind of making an assumption about our program that it was going to be, I think I was thinking more of a quiz than a poll, where there is such a thing as a correct answer. So that raises a good design question. Do we want to have questions do we want to worry about correct answers or not right now? And I would argue, that's not a bad thing to put under a stretch feature. And we can start in our MVP with just polls with questions. And then once we get that done, we can decide if we want to add a feature where you can create a poll that's really a quiz. Right? We'd want to be able to display the results of a poll. That's a really good point. So this does start to shift our feature requirements if we have a correct answer or not. Because if we don't have correct answers, then what we really have to make sure we're doing is recording everyone's response to it and displaying it. And so that does bring up.
I would take out the correct answers bit just because a poll doesn't have correct answers, quizzes do. So if we want to call it a poll, it should only be opinions.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that makes sense. So we need a couple more features here, right? Create a poll, add a question to a poll, view poll results, all answers for the poll.
Yeah, continuing your thought, you said that the responses for everyone who has. I think that's actually a big feature.
Say that again, please. I was a little hard to hear.
Save the responses from every person who has ever done the poll.
Yep. I think we have that covered here with submit an answer to a question. Do we like answer or do we want to use response instead?
Response is more accurate.
I would agree. So we've got create a question, submit a response to a question, create a poll, building the poll, saving the poll. We're going to have to be able to add questions to the poll. Right? Add questions to poll, give poll a title. Good question. Do we care about people taking the poll more than once? Right now, we don't, because I'm not even going to open the door to worrying about users and user accounts and things like that. But yes, in the real world, we would definitely care about that. But even then, you might build it in 2 steps, right? Because we can build all this, not care about that. And then when we start adding in users, worrying about that. And I think we've got a pretty good list here. So create a question, submit a response to a question. What else do we have to do with questions? There's one important feature here, I would say, that is missing in terms of creating questions. People have to be able to, when I create a question, I have to be able to create some responses. Right? If we're going to, I think we should keep it as multiple choice type questions. So that lets us play with the data in an interesting way. So questions still need responses. And really, we've kind of got two feature sets here in a lot of ways, right? We've got creating and viewing, right? So there's really two parts to this application that we're talking about: viewing and interacting with polls, and creating polls and questions. So we've got create a question, create responses for a question, submit a response to a question. I think I'm really going to put this under the category of take a poll, right? The user should be able to take a poll. And we'll see, maybe we just have the user submit the response to all the questions at once. Probably that's going to be the easiest way to do it. And then we have, of course, create a poll. And sort of under this taking poll feature is view poll results. I think I'll put create polls and questions sort of as its own category, because this is all sort of related. And so again, sort of, for me at least, this is why I kind of like doing this first, because we get to do all this work that really touches on a lot of program behavior. Like, how is this thing going to work? What features do we need? So this is a pretty good start, I think. We've got taking a poll. You have to be able to view poll results. We probably want to view a poll, right? You need to be able to look at a poll. A stretch goal could be view all polls and select from that list. That seems pretty good. Creating questions, creating polls, creating responses for a question. This feels like a pretty good start, and we can kind of move on to, I think, our next step. I'll reorganize this later because it all is getting a bit out of order. But we've come up with some fake data. We've looked for edge cases. We're deciding what to ignore. We've identified features. Let's design our data model. Oh, did someone have a question? And can people see okay right now with the way I have the split screen and everything?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. So kind of running down my list. Johnny, if you're there, what are some models that we're going to need?
Pass.
Okay, well, think about it in terms of tables. If we were not worrying about Django ORM and models and stuff, and we were just constructing our Postgres database, and we wanted to be able to store polls and questions and responses, what's one table that we would need? And this is not a trick question, by the way.
think I'm just overthinking it right now. Mm,
You want to phone a friend?
yes.
Okay, who do you want to phone?
Dan.
One of them's gonna be a poll.
Yeah,
Oh.
and yeah, you probably were this. I totally understand because it is. That's why I was saying it's not a trick question. I kind of knew that you knew. Yeah, we need a poll. Yeah, we'll need a question, right? And do we need a response?
I'd say we need a response.
Yes.
Okay, we need a response. Nick, if you're there, and not the Skynet Nick, for our poll model or table, what are some columns or fields that it's going to need?
Let me think. The question ID. I don't know how. Are we gonna? Is this gonna be like a tree, or not a tree? I'm thinking of a database.
Right, right.
So
Right.
would it be the question ID, or am I driving that backwards?
Yeah, I see where you're going. And the good news is we don't even have to worry right now about how we'll implement this. What I hear you saying is that a poll is going to have the questions that belong to the poll.
Yeah.
And you're correct that some sort of foreign key relationship is probably where we're going with this. And speaking of relationships, Nick, what kind of relationship between like the poll table and the question table will we have? Like one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one?
One to many.
Yeah, I would agree. One poll can have many questions.
I think we have that backwards, to be honest. I think the question should have a data field for the poll that it's assigned to, kind of like how we had with Pokemon and trainers. Because one
Right.
trainer can have Pokemon, right? But the one-to-many relationship actually went from the Pokemon to the trainer, not the other way around.
That is an excellent point, and I am going to rephrase this to get rid of. I kind of went a little too detailed. Should be able to have many questions, and then that way we don't even. You're. I think you might be right in terms of how we have to implement it. And I kind of don't even want us to think about that right now. So, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I did kind of get into the weeds there, which does raise a good question. Should a question be able to like be used in multiple polls? And do we care?
Yeah, maybe it'll have to be a many to many.
Yeah. My vote would be right. My vote would be we can always come back to that later, and it might be a many to many. And right now we really only the nice thing about this is all we really have to think and care about is what a poll needs. And we know that a poll needs a bunch of questions. What else does a poll need in its data model?
A title.
Yeah, I think some sort of title is important. What else? I'm not sure if it needs anything else, but there might be.
Whoever made the poll. I don't know. I know we're not caring about users, but
Maybe a date created. And
some case where you may want to do an analysis. A poll was asked at one point in the year. You ask the same poll a different part of the year and see how answers have changed.
Yep, title, date created, creator poll. If if we want to throw in a users table, we could, to be honest, it wouldn't be the worst thing, even if we don't deal with login and stuff. I'll put a question mark by that, and we can kind of implement this last and worry about it when we get there. I think this feels pretty good for the poll. Number of times answered. So that raises a good question. Where are the answers to these questions going to live? And how do we have to connect them to the poll?
Yeah, I think it should be connected with the poll. I was thinking the many to many, like I was thinking like a lot of these feel like many to many, but the question could be shared among many polls. It'd be the same question asked among different polls, right? Which means that you want to share the answers in the poll itself to those questions, because you don't want to cross those question answers into different polls.
Right. You raise a really good point, and I'm actually going to go back to our sample data here, which is some of the value of this. We have these two polls. Let's add a third question. Someone give me a third question that we can come up with an answer to. That's not like a, timeless riddle. Is Chat GPT the father of AI? Yes. No. And we are going to take that same question and put it in our other poll. And this is why making up data is incredibly useful, because it helps us really see these things. And Dan, you raise a good point. What you're basically saying is we have this question in two places. The answer is here for poll number one. And I'm going to come up with different names so it's easier to discuss them. We'll call this one the awesome poll, and we'll call this one the other poll. So for the awesome poll, we only want the answers to question 3. We don't want the ones that came up over here. For the other poll, we don't want these as well. So that does make our data model a little more complicated, and we're going to have to somehow keep track of answers to the questions to the poll. Based on my experience, we may need another model for this. This may need to end up being some sort of join table or like poll question answer or something. Stepping back a bit and talking about design, one way to simplify this is decide that a question only belongs to one poll and not worry about reusing questions between polls. Like if we want the same question in 2 polls, we just got to have 2 different questions, and it makes life more complicated, and it makes a little bit of duplication of data, but it makes our data model simpler.
Yeah, I think that would be the way to go, because people's answer to the question may be skewed depending on the poll, like the other questions in the poll.
Yeah.
So you probably want to keep it separate, even if it's worded exactly the same, I would think.
Yeah. I would agree with that as well. Fancy is cool, and it's kind of fancy to be able to share a question between polls. And if kind of relating this to a real world example, if this started to get lots of use and the questions got bigger, maybe if these were like, if it was quizzes and they were math problems or something, or just the questions grew very complex, maybe then we would start to care about being able to share questions as a feature. The truth is, even then, writing a function to copy a question from one poll to another is not that difficult. So I tend to agree with people, and I think restricting our design here will make our life easier. And we are going to decide that a question belongs to one poll and one poll only. And maybe what we need to do here is I'm just going to make a note about relationships. I don't know if we'll need to fill this out. Has one or more questions belongs to only one poll. One poll has many questions. And in fact, this is where a diagram certainly wouldn't hurt. Question belongs to a single poll. Excalidraw. I might bust out Excalidraw in a minute. What about, and in fact, we could also use the SQL thingamajiggy. What about responses?
Yeah, I think you follow that same logic. If you establish that relationship, you basically could do a copy paste job that with the questions to response.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to see about, I think maybe using the SQL draw, maybe this is the right time for this. So we did go back to the SQL. So we've got polls and we've got questions. And a poll has title. Poll has and is this visualization useful for people and can people see it right now?
Wouldn't the question have the poll ID rather than the poll have a question ID?
Oh,
then a
you're
poll-
totally right. Thank you. And in terms of pseudocoding, I honestly, I often do this just when I'm writing it out. I think for learning purposes, it is useful to, let's see, how do we, there we go. Question, poll ID. For learning purposes, I figure it's useful to have the visualization aid. Even though we're going to make Django models, again, I'm really using this because I think it's a good visual tool in this case. And for a poll, we talked about just adding some columns.
Yeah, I think
That.
you need to delete the question ID column out of polls and connect the poll ID and questions to the ID in polls.
Oh, yes, you're totally right. I apologize. Let's do this. Let's do this again. This is the danger of, this is why you don't want to actually get down to this level when you're pseudocoding stuff. I just really wanted the diagram.
This is why you work at a really big company where they have dedicated like data engineers.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an expectation that most software engineers should be able to build like a simple data model. It's more so that we're kind of jumping around with the tools and like we've been working at a pretty high level, and with this visualization tool, we did have to jump into the weeds a bit. So we'll see how this goes. Excalibur might have been the right move here, to be honest. Polls, questions, and then we've got responses. And just to flesh questions out a bit, right? The question probably needs a title. And our response is going to need some sort of, I'm just going to call it title or text for lack of a better term. And then our question needs some responses. Oh yeah, and question ID is not needed at all in the polls table. So let me get rid of that one. So let me ask a question while I'm doing this. Do we need a separate responses model or table? Could we just put all the responses to a question on the question table? And it's not a clear cut.
It would have to be a design decision to limit the number of responses you can have to a question. If you want unlimited response options, you'd need a separate table like it is now. But if you limit it to say just 5, then you can have 5 response options and just allow them to be null if you need less.
Right.
Couldn't you, I'm sorry, but couldn't you use a list and expect a list and append that list per question or responses that come in?
You could also do something like that. And really what you're kind of saying is like, take a column in our questions table and stick a bunch of text in there and have our program know that that text represents a list or some sort of data structure. I would say that's generally not considered good practice. The truth is people do it all the time. And certainly like for an MVP or for hacking something together, it's a good option to have on the table. For learning purposes, I think keeping a responses table or model probably makes sense. We can see how it goes. But again, it's good to think about because it goes back to questions of design. How many responses should a question be able to have? And making decisions around that. Related to all this, where do we want to store the answers?
Adam,
Yes.
so I'm really not understanding why people want to put the responses in the questions, because I would assume that with the responses, you'd be storing the counter. So every time somebody picks that response, the counter on that response increases. And that's where you can go through and find the numbers of what people have chosen. Because otherwise, you're looking at just another table in your questions, holding that data, and it kind of gets away from the relational thing.
Right. That you raise a really good point. And I think in part, I might need to rename this from title to description or something. And I think you're right, by the way. In part, I asked the question more as a thought experiment. I would agree that we probably wouldn't want to do that. And what you also point out is that there's sort of like when we're talking about responses, there's really 2 things that we're talking about in our poll. To go back to the mock data, like this is question number 1. What is your favorite food? And I will add chocolate here. I remember someone saying that, and that should definitely be on the list. And, these are the responses, right? And then Mickey, you're also pointing out, hey, but we also have to store the number of responses. And I may actually, this is where my use of language may be failing me. We might need another term here. I think you're right, because we need to store for a response, like what the response is. And then we need to store like what people chose, which very well might
Okay.
look like some sort of counter.
I think I'm confused because we're calling it a poll. So I know it's really confusing when we start talking about what's the correct answer for it, as opposed to a question that you select an answer and then it just tells you what the right answer was. So if it's a poll and they want to track how many people picked A, B, or C, or D, that's where I'm seeing a counter with the response in the table. So that just gets incremented every time that response is picked. And then
Yeah.
you could show people at the end how many responses, how many people are for A, how many people for B, how many people for C.
And
As opposed to just having the results be the one answer that they should have picked.
you're right. We did move away from the one correct answer, and you're totally right there. And you're right as well about counting the number of responses. We also have to store the possible responses, right? Somewhere in our database needs to live like sushi, grilled cheese, pizza, and chocolate. And I had sort of been imagining that would live here, right?
Yeah, and that would be something that the database could pull to supply the text.
Yeah,
If you're like listing out the items. Do
yeah.
we just add another column that's a counter that would
think-
then change for an integer?
I think that is a really good idea, actually, and in a lot of ways, a really simple and straightforward way to build a minimum viable prototype here. Especially as we don't have a concept of users yet, and we're just keeping things simple. Having a response table, and we already have decided that we're not sharing questions between polls, which means we're not sharing responses between questions. So a response is always going to belong to one question that belongs to one poll, and we can store both the description of the response and the number of responses that we get. What are people's thoughts about that?
I think
That
the right
looks
way to
good.
Sorry,
It makes sense to count any response because whether it's a poll or a quiz, you want to count all the responses, especially the wrong ones. Because let's say you had a quiz and everybody was answering the wrong response D. Well, you need to keep track of that. You need to know that so you can address like, why is everybody getting this question wrong? Maybe we're teaching it wrong or whatever, you know.
That's an excellent point. That in a lot of ways, even if we wanted to design a poll, in a lot of ways, a correct answer is just a poll with a question with one correct answer. It's just a question with a response, and one of the responses has a special is correct answer Boolean flag on it. And we're kind of building for the general case here. So we've got a poll. It's got one or more questions, a title, date created. We might add a creator of the poll. And we've moved the answers to the questions into our response or responses model. And a response belongs to only one question. And I'm going to add in examples as I build this model out, because that helps me keep track of things. And our questions needs a title. Example, what is your favorite food? Our poll needs a title. Example, awesome poll. And now we can kind of see has, let's say, at least 2 responses. And now we kind of have our model mapped out a bit, and we kind of see some of the relationships here. How are people feeling about our data model? And what questions do people have around this, if any? And I also want to check in and see if people are finding this useful, or if this feels like review, and if kind of working through design the design process this way so far seems like it might be something that will kind of help you as you encounter future tasks.
I think it's good to go through this exercise of designing up front. Sort of random question, maybe hazarding going off on a tangent,
Please.
but
Yeah.
if let's say you're a hiring manager and you're looking through someone's GitHub and you see this sort of supporting documentation to somebody's app, that would be a positive in your mind, right? To see sort of a peek inside their brain and how they structured this before they started to code.
Huge positive. This is the hard part of software engineering. The technical part is hard in its own way, but you know, kind of once you learn it, you can do it, and it's relatively straightforward. This is like the other 50% of software engineering. Like 50% is all the technical implementation stuff, and this is the other 50%. And half the time it comes down to the person you're working with, or the feature that you've been given might have some of this, but will it have missing parts? And depending on how the company works, the expectation may be that, like, as a software engineer, you can kind of fill in these missing pieces. Like, our job is really, it's easy to get lost in the technology, but it's really like, we're here to solve real world problems, or create tools that can get used in the real world. And our job is to, like, take some real world problem and figure out how to, like, translate, map, and model it into something that can be done with software. And going back to ChatGPT, you know, it can do more and more of this, but in a lot of ways, all that tools like ChatGPT do is make this part of software engineering more valuable. There's some great questions in the chat, so I'm just going to kind of run through them. There's a great point about kind of the challenge for me right now is actually implementing this in Django models and doing this. And we're going to do this in a bit. And this is a perfect time for a break. Yeah, I'll run through the chat questions and then we'll take a break. One reason I like doing this is because, for me at least, once I've done all this and then I go to the actual work of, like, working on the Django models, I feel like there's a lot I don't have to think about now because I've already done it. And all I have to think about is how to implement this. And ideally, that's kind of what pair programming is like as well. There was a question in the chat about user personas. A user persona is sort of a more sophisticated way of thinking about, like, a product or an application. It's something that a user experience researcher would do. It's not really relevant for what we're doing. It's about, like, different types of users. Like, an example might be, if you're YouTube, a 13-year-old and a 50-year-old are going to interact with YouTube in different ways and care about different things. And a user experience researcher or designer might come up with user personas. That's super cool stuff, but a little out of scope for kind of the things that we're looking at with software engineering. There was also a question, do we need at least 2 responses tables for each question? That's correct. We're going to need at least 2 rows in our response table for each question. The only reason I added that as a requirement is because if a question only has one answer, it doesn't feel very useful. And that's a great example of a design decision that software engineers usually make. And honestly, maybe we don't want this. Maybe there's some special test case where having one response actually we do need. So I'll put a question mark here, because especially when you're making design decisions at, like, the lowest level of your application, it's worth putting a little thought into. But that was my thinking around that, yeah, and I hope that makes sense. And if not, let me know. Leo, you were asking about formal systems or tools. There are tons of formal systems and tools. Trello and Jira are both popular ones. In terms of, like, a lot of this, like, in the real world, like, a lot of this that we're doing right now might end up in a Trello card or a Jira card. Honestly, half the time it just ends up in a Google Doc that the engineering team uses. It really kind of depends what level we're working at. I honestly think there's a lot of value to just putting it in text, because what we're gonna do is we're gonna take all this, stick it in our Python file, make it a big comment, and then we can kind of like write code around it. There's actually a whole approach called literate programming that never really took off, where the idea was to be able to have like really rich descriptions of your program alongside the source code itself. It's a really neat idea, and it just never really took off. In a lot of ways, what has taken off is things like with strong typing or documentation. Like VS Code, if you write comments and document your classes and methods, VS Code can understand that and give you a lot of hints. So it's not quite the same thing, but it's sort of similar. The question is there a right way to do this? There is sort of a right way. Again, it really depends who you talk to and what level you're at. The rightness becomes more important as the program becomes bigger and the team becomes bigger. For just one person, there's less of a right way, I would say. And I think those are most of the questions in the chat. Let's see, it's 10 o'clock. How about a 15-minute break? What do we want, 15 or 20? 10, 15, 20, 18. Yeah. We'll come back at 10:20. So that's in like 15 minutes. And think about during the break. And the first question I'm going to ask is, I do want to make sure we write some code. So, there's a lot more we could do to build out our routes and stuff, and how much time we might want to spend like designing routes and views, or if we should just start writing some code. So let's come back at 10:20. So like 15 minutes plus a minute, and have a good break, everyone. And thank you. So 20 after the hour.